Hey folks, welcome back to the podcast. This is Matt Cuda, the voice of reason in the wildlife photography space. And this is episode 82, the final move to Sony. So about 2 years ago, if you remember, I began looking at Sony as a viable platform to replace Canon. At the time, I was very unhappy with Canon's direction. I was unhappy with the way they were going as a company. I was unhappy with their apparent arrogance. I was unhappy with them firing Art Morris as the Canon Explorer of Light. And I thought it was just time for a change. I thought it was time to move away from Canon. And I became a hybrid shooter at that time. I still had my Canon 7D Mark II. I still had an older 1 series camera. And so I was interested in buying a new camera. I settled on the Sony a7 III, and it was not a mistake. That camera is amazing. Amazing image quality, just superb and in just about every way. And during that time when I made that switch, the EOS R was barely out, and I had done a review on that camera, and I did not think it was up to par. And so that led me kind of further down the Sony path. So I used that a7 III for 2 years, 3 years, however long it's been now. And I've had no real issues with it. I haven't had to send it back. Good firmware upgrades for it. We'll get into all this in a minute, but you know, that helped move me toward Sony. And so the point of all that is that I finally have made the switch completely from Canon to Sony. I sold all my equipment, almost all my equipment. We'll get into that in a second. Almost all my Canon equipment has been sold as of this morning. I shipped off the last lens, and I don't feel bad about it. I think it was the right choice for me. I'm not saying it's the right choice for you. It's very subjective. But I have to say, I'm looking forward to the next, 3 years with Sony, and hopefully longer. So why Sony? Why did I move to Sony? I kind of talked about that a little bit already. I mean, first and foremost, Sony was the underdog for so long, and I mean, who doesn't like an underdog, right? And me being disgruntled already with some of the things that Canon was doing and some of the issues they were not addressing, I felt like it was a good time. So why Sony? Sony, in my opinion, has the best sensors in the business. I mean, they're high quality. They have high dynamic range. They have often do not have anti-aliasing filters, especially in their R versions. Yes, Canon had the EOS R at that time, so forth. So they were doing the same thing. But I think as far as overall quality, I think low light performance, I mean, Sony was winning, and I think really still is winning in the sensor game. I think over the last few years, Canon has closed that gap a little bit. But when you look at the price of Sony bodies versus Canon bodies, that's another big one. That's another big reason. Sony came out there with some really nice. When they went to the a7 III and the a7R III, they really went for the gold, for the gusto. I mean, it was big sensors, good autofocus, better made bodies. Really, for the first time, Sony had a full frame camera that could be used by everybody, from wedding photographers to nature guy, landscape, wildlife, sports. They had the cameras. They had the A9 out at the time, and that was a big deal. 20 frames per second. Great sensor that you could actually shoot in silent mode with no blackout. Just amazing quality coming out of Sony. I just couldn't ignore it. They also tend to have a little bit lighter weight bodies. Now that comes with the cost of not being as ergonomic as Canon, but they do have a lighter options for Canon for bodies, and so I like that about them. The A7 III, when it originally came out, it was only a $1,900, and I think it was $1,999. And really, I considered it a lost leader for Sony, and I think that's the way they treated it. And they pulled so many people into the fold with that camera. That A7 III, which I own, is really, in the end, the biggest thing that hooked me. And now I'm not going to go back. But they're just cutting edge. Everything that they do is cutting edge. They have frequent firmware updates, not just bug fixes, but new features. Like, for instance, on the A7 R3 and the A7 III, they had like, I think it was version 3 of the firmware, and that gave us animal eye detect. So it's things like that just keep the customers happy. So where am I at now in the process? I thought I would talk about that a little bit, and I apologize if you hear any construction noise going on. There's a bunch of logging going on across the street from the house, and it's making a lot of noise. Anyway, so I told you I sold off my Canon gear. So what am I doing? What gear did I sell, and what am I going to replace that with? That's a big question right now in what I'm doing. There's some key areas that have not been replaced yet, and so I'm working through that. Because, when you sell your gear and it's not new, you're going to take a loss. And so, buying all that gear back takes time, research, so on and so forth. But what I sold was my Sigma 150 to 600 Contemporary, which I absolutely love. And it worked good with the A7 III, but it didn't work great. And so I have replaced that with the Sony 200 to 600 5.6 to 6.3 G lens, and that has been a huge performance boost. That I used that down in Florida in 2021. I rented it. I fell in love with it, and I had to have it, so I just got that in. Be taking that out probably. I've done some backyard bird photography with it. It turned out well. Just going to test it a little bit more, probably, somewhere with captive animals, probably like the zoo or somewhere, just to make sure everything's working properly. So that's a big replacement. That was probably the biggest replacement. And then, selling my Canon 300 f4L. Okay, and that was an important lens for me because I used that lens for butterfly photography, for songbird trigger trap flight photography, because of the f4. It allowed me to get a higher shutter speed. So that I'm going to have to come up with a replacement for that. Probably will end up with the 70 to 200 f4 from Sony eventually. I also sold my 24 millimeter Canon lens. It was an older lens, so it wasn't holding up to the newer resolution of the cameras, and so I ended up selling that off. And what I replaced that one with, at least for now, is the Rokinon 24 millimeter 1.8, and I'm going to be doing a review on that lens coming up. But that is a great lens. Sharp corner to corner sharpness, really. not a whole lot of chromatic aberration and all that. So I will be taking that out for a spin soon. Probably going to do a waterfall with that one. Probably going to go to Western North Carolina and do some waterfalls. So what else did I sell off that's important and has to be replaced? My Canon 7D Mark II. That was my backup camera and my APS-C for more distant photographs. Something has to replace that, okay? So I guess one of the things I looked at replacing it with was a Sony APS-C camera. Well, when I got to looking at those, and I've used them some in the past, there's several things I don't like about them. One being the positioning of the viewfinder is just weird, very weird. The other thing I don't like about them is the ergonomics, although you can get a grip for them that makes them a little better. But probably the biggest thing I don't like about them is Sony does not treat them as a professional camera. I'm going to get into that more in a minute. So I have to come up with an option. So I'm looking heavily at a used A7R III. What that will do for me is that's going to give me 42.4 megapixels. That allows me to do my APS-C cropping, so I don't have to get an APS-C camera. It gives me a big 42 megapixel sensor for high res landscape images, higher res, downsampling for 4K, videos, 10 frames a second. The autofocus is pretty good. It's maybe a little bit less than my A7 III. A7 III has a really good autofocus system. So that's what I'm looking at for my second body. Now, that is not going to be a backup body. That's going to be a frontline body. I'm not going to have backup bodies anymore. I'm not going to have any bodies that don't serve a real purpose. Not just backup. I use these for various things. So it'll have purpose. And so I'm looking at that heavily. I looked briefly into the A7R2 since it's getting pretty cheap on the market right now. Problem with the A7R2, guys, is the autofocus system is not there. And so it's fine for landscapes, fine for macros, but it will not do well in birds in flight and that type of thing that I do fairly frequently. So I kind of had to leave that alone. But that's a great deal. If you just do landscapes, that A7R III, or I guess you're supposed to say Alpha, right? But I say A7R3. A7R2 is a great landscape lens. So that's what I'm adding in the future. Like I said, I'll probably be doing the 70 to 200 f4 in there as well, because there are times where that just makes good sense. But I don't know yet. I haven't just fully decided what I'm going to do there. But other than that, the only other lens I will probably add is something in the ultra wide, like in the 14 millimeter, 16 millimeter range. I may add a 28 millimeter. The 28 millimeter is really a neat. I really fell in love with the 28 when I was doing photojournalism, and I love the perspective that it gives you. It gives you a wide shot, but it's not so wide that there's a lot of distortion, and it's not too wide to where you can't use it for some portraiture, close up, action shots with people and that type of thing. So I'm looking at that lens also. That's a Sony. That's a non-Zeiss lens, actually, a non-G master lens, but it's very sharp. There's the Sony 20 millimeter G lens, which is a very, very good one. So I'm looking at all that. I'm not primarily a landscape photographer, so I don't want to spend a ridiculous amount of money in that realm. Yes, but I do enough of it that I need some gear in that area. So what am I keeping from my Canon line? So probably not too surprising. I am keeping the Canon 100mm 2.8 macro. Love that lens. It works so good on my A7 III also for doing butterfly shots. Just, portraiture, anything that requires really sharp, high quality images. That Canon 100 macro is awesome. The other Canon lens I'm keeping is the 50mm 1.8 plastic fantastic, right? It's not worth selling. It's so lightweight, it doesn't take up any space in the camera bag, and it gives you a fairly sharp lens in that 50mm range, which does come in handy sometimes. So I'm going to keep that, not going to replace that immediately. What else am I going to do here? So let's talk about what I don't like about Sony. And this is going to be a fairly short, just kind of what's going on in my world episode. But what do I not like about Sony? I don't like Sony's professional services. Now, when I was on Canon, I was just a diehard member of Canon professional services, and I loved the way they did it. They had a points system where you would give them your serial number off your lens and your bodies, and you get points for each one. If it was an older lens, you might get less points. If it's a newer lens, you get a lot of points. If it was a professional lens, you get a lot of points. If it wasn't a professional lens, you get less points. Well, Sony has this weird thing where, and I think it's because they're just not as rich generally, as in doesn't have as much money. They have this thing where you have to have 2 professional full frame bodies. Okay, so that rings some bells with me because, first of all, there's probably a lot of pros out there that have the APS-C, A6500, A6600, and might have an A7R4 or an A7R3, right? They got both. And to me, who's to say that should keep them out of the professional services section of the website? Why should that keep them out? That makes zero sense to me. Because there are professionals that are, they swear by APS-C. And I used to be one of those guys, and I kind of still am. I love the APS-C. It's a lot packed into 24 megapixels. What most people don't realize is that you can actually crop quite heavily into a 24 megapixel sensor that's APS-C because there's so many little sensors on there, little micro sensors on there. I can't think of the word right now, but on that sensor, they're just crammed on there. Little lenses, basically, is what they are. And some people actually call them micro lenses. But so I don't understand that. I don't understand that at all. And I am going to have 2 professional bodies, so it's not going to be an issue for me. But I don't understand why that is a prerequisite. It makes zero sense. Zero. The other thing that you have to do with Sony is you have to have, I think it's 3 Zeiss G or G Master lenses. That's not that big of a deal. That's okay. I'm okay with that. But I just don't like the body thing. I think they should do a point system, just like Canon does. And then you get different levels of support, like, silver, gold, platinum, so on and so forth. The other thing I didn't like about their website on the professional services was, and I'm not a member yet, by the way, of professional services. I don't have enough gear yet to be a member. But one thing I didn't really like was they didn't seem to have a robust loaning program for trying out lenses. They do loan out during repairs, and they do let you get lenses to test to see if you're interested in buying them. But it didn't look to me as robust as what Canon does. And I guess that's kind of to be expected since they're a newer big player in the game. But yeah, that just kind of stuck in my craw a little bit. I didn't like that. The other thing I don't like about Sony is that they are slowly raising the prices as they become the king, one of the big kings in the industry. Case in point, the A7 III, when it came out, was only $1,999, $1,999 US. The A7 IV came out not long ago, and it cost $2,500. So, that's a $500 increase, right? And that's nothing to laugh about. I mean, that's quite a bit of money. When you consider you can buy a used A9 for that price now. So I'm kind of scratching my head on what Sony is doing there. I assume that they are, moving that up a little bit. It's not going to be a loss leader for them. So that's unfortunate, because I think that was a great price point on the A7 III and a good entry-level pro quality body. So the next thing I don't like about Sony is they don't really have a flagship APS-C professional body. So we just talked about that, right? We just talked about that, and they don't consider any of their APS-C bodies professional. Okay. I don't like that. I don't like that mentality, because to me that's subjective. What determines a professional body versus non-professional? Yeah, it doesn't have 2 card slots, maybe. I think maybe the A6600, does that have 2 card slots? I'm not sure, but I feel like they need to introduce one. And I know why they're not, guys. I know why they're not, because their big megapixel cameras have APS-C crop mode, so I get that. But again, there's people that like and prefer the images from an APS-C camera. Maybe there's not enough of them out there. I don't know. But I just feel like that's weird. I guess maybe they're going to phase those out over time and maybe go completely full frame. The rumor is now, by the way, they're coming out with a medium format SLR. Mirrorless, and professional quality and so forth, of course. So they're continuing to get bigger and bigger sensors, which I'm fine with that. So maybe they're moving away. Maybe they're getting ready to move away from the APS-C. I don't know. But that's really about it. Another thing I don't like about their APS-C cameras is the viewfinder is on the side of the body instead of in the center. And that's, I know I'm being picky, but having shot, regular pentaprism DSLRs and SLRs for so many years, it irritates me. I'm not big on that. So I'm kind of bothered by it, I guess. Anyway, I don't know if you know this, but if you've listened to this in the past, I was a huge APS-C fan. And so I have a special place in my heart for APS-C. And it is nice because you get that crop. It is nice because you can crop and post later and still have good results, compared to, when I crop my 24 megapixel A7 III, I don't get near the quality that I used to get when I cropped heavily into my 7D Mark II from Canon, believe it or not. It's true. So anyway, I digress there. That's really all I had for this episode. Just a quick, here's where I'm at with things. This is where I'm at with the whole transition to Sony. Still love Canon. Have no reason whatsoever to hate Canon other than just some of the weird stuff they did before they started doing what they needed to do with the mirrorless cameras. I always will have a special place in my heart for Canon, and I can't say I'll never go back. There may be a time that I go back. So who knows, right? So in closing, I give you an idea of what's coming down the road. I definitely want to do a review on the Oben window mount, CWM01. That is a window mount that I'm going to be trying to use for video this year. So I'm doing more video with hummingbirds and so forth. So I'm going to be doing a review on that. It's a very small mount, so I don't know if it's going to stand up to larger lenses. We'll have to wait and see. I'm going to do a review on my Rokinon 24mm 1.8 for Sony. You'll have to wait and see. Obviously, I like it, but why do I like it and what don't I like about it? And then I'm going to have a big full review on the Sony 200-600G that I just bought. Given that I do a lot of wildlife, I can really give you a lot of details and a lot of photographs that I've taken and what it can do and what it can't do. So I'm looking forward to that. Those will both, probably all three of those reviews will be YouTube reviews, and I'll also put them on the podcast here as well. So I'm looking forward to that. As far as trips coming up, so far the only thing I have on my calendar is a trip west to western North Carolina for some waterfall and landscape photography, and then I've got another trip in the fall planned, 2 trips in the fall planned. One to Cataloochee, where I'll be camping there for a couple days and doing some elk photography, maybe doing some astrophotography, and then later on that fall going down again to Florida to do some bird photography down there, winter birding and so forth. So looking forward to that. But anyway, that's really all I had for today. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye.